Thanks, Danielle. So the paper that I'm giving now is part of a project, as Danielle said, that I'm working on now, a book on stars and masculinities in contemporary Italian cinema. Male stars have received surprisingly little critical attention in Italian film studies. So much work has been done, for example, on the maggiorate fisiche, the female stars of post-war Italy, and their relation to changing concepts of national identity. But male stars, I think, have been rather neglected. But the last decade has seen a significant flourishing of male stars in important film roles. Whereas the panorama of female stars perhaps remains more uncertain. One of the research questions I'm working with concerns the relationship between contemporary forms of masculinity in Italy and their on-screen representation. This is, of course, a very thorny question. To what extent do screen representations reflect or feed into the ways that gender is perceived and performed in society? I have one model, well, I have many, but one that I'll mention here, Donna Keberty's work on American screen masculinity, where she says that on-screen performances not only reflect the cultural moment in which they're situated, but also feed back into the discourse, becoming part of the mediated process through which understandings of gendered identity are situated. One of the ideas I'm working with at the moment concerns how, although the Berlusconi years and the recent crisis of Veinismo have led to an emphasis on the objectified female body, both on screen and in politics, and Danielle has brilliantly critiqued this phenomenon in a recent article in Italian Studies. But it is also foregrounded a model of supposed hyper-heterosexuality embodied by Berlusconi, which critics and philosophers are currently getting to grips with. And here I might briefly note the relative lateness of masculinity studies in Italy, a fact which is partly due to the lack of institutionalization of gender studies. Sandro Bellassai has said of Berlusconi that lui non è altro che l'autobiografia sessuale della nazione maschile. You may take issue with this, I think, but the terms in which this hyper-masculinization have been read have been quite problematic. There's been a running together often of masculinity and sexuality tout court. Recent essays on Berlusconi have talked of how the supposedly uneasy fit between his excessive and compulsive sexual activity and what they speak of as his feminization, his love of plastic surgery and makeup, his penchant for bodily self-care, hair transplants, his tendency to rely on narratives of intimita, all render him, in the view of some theorists, as feminized. This started certainly in the Anglophone context with an article by Stephen Gundel in 1995, where he referred to Berlusconi as a feminized, powdered man. Leaving aside some of the implications of this, it's clearly not a positive thing to be compared to a woman in this context. Marco Belpoliti, in his recent book Il Corpo del Capo, at various points refers to Berlusconi both as a travestito and a transessuale. He cites approvingly Franco Cordelli's allegorical pamphlet, Il Duco di Mantova, in which Berlusconi is, of course, allegorized as the eponymous Duca. Con il ritorno del melodramma, il mondo è stato conquistato dalle donne. Siamo tutti donne. Le donne riducono donne, anche il Duca lo è un travestito. Okay, so leaving aside some of the frankly offensive connotations here, and noting how all these terms somehow manage to exonerate hegemonic heterosexual masculinity, I'm interested in this discourse around feminization and queering masculinities. I'm elsewhere in my book working on the proliferation of films and TV series about the 1970s in Italy, especially the success of the TV series of Romanzo Criminale, which, being even more violent and sexually explicit than the film, might allow us to wonder about the relationship between this representation of an unreconstructed vernacular masculinity and the contemporary context marked by the hyper-masculine performance of Berlusconismo. We might, for instance, wonder about the return to a 1970s that is depicted, as in Romanzo Criminale, with barely any reference to one of the key developments of the period, feminism. Here, though, I just want to look at a different star and genre, Riccardo Scamarcio, and the rom-com, to think about some of the ways the film that I'm looking at, might be engaging with ideas around male objectification and feminization. So, Scamarcio. The renaissance since the mid-2000s of the popular Italian comedy has had as one of its most popular filoni the teen comedy, of which the initial star was undoubtedly Riccardo Scamarcio, who shot to fame in the two Moccia adaptations, Tre metri sopra il cielo and O voglia di te. His role as the troubled step involves a brooding machismo that belies an emotionality that manifests itself around his relationship with women. The films have received very little critical attention, especially in Italy, and the few discussions of Scamarcio that have taken place have focused on his status as a heartthrob and of the teen audience that he attracted. The teen film has never enjoyed critical favour, and the target of the opprobrium has often been its young female audience. And as Nash and Lati have noted in relation to Leonardo DiCaprio's stardom post-Titanic, quote, the proximity to both feminized iconography and the female consumers carries with it certain degrading connotations for male stars. Scamarcio's subsequent career in middle-brow films by respected directors such as Lucchetti, Ozpetek, Costa Gavras and others is still marked by a perceived desire for legitimacy, as evidenced by his frequent disavowal of his own physical appeal and star image, both via interviews and even by means of self-parody in film like Uomo Perfetto, as we'll see. The tension around Scamarcio and the young audience became most acute when he played Sergio Seggio in the adaptation of Seggio's film La Prima Linea. Critics were worried that Scamarcio's impressionable young fans would get the wrong idea about extra-parliamentary violence in the 1970s, and even the victims groups who were consulted during the film's funding process expressed considerable anxiety about a possible glamorization of terrorism through the stars. So I'll leave that for now. I just want to move on to L'Uomo Perfetto. Produced by Cattleya, known for their quality mainstream products, significantly a remake of a Spanish film in the 1990s, Cha Cha Cha, which I'll come back to. The film is unusual as it's a more conventional type of rom-com than we usually see in Italian cinema. It has lots of similarities with a film like The Proposal. So we have Lucia, a mannish career woman dedicated to her career in advertising, who is eventually softened up by Antonio, played by Riccardo Scamarcio. Lucia employs Antonio, who is an actor, to seduce her best friend, Maria, so that Lucia can go off with Maria's fiancé. Of course, Lucia and Antonio fall in love, even as she is training him up for conquest. I'll just very briefly show a clip to give you a sense of the seduction process.
Allora non si capisce niente.
Ma neanche leggendo il libretto?
No, in tedesco, guarda. Tedesco.
Devi leggere qua.
Non avrei intenzione di mettermi quella roba.
Certo, torturate come beccato.
Lucia, non te lo smalto, no, però.
Qua di smalto non ho mai fatto male a nessuno. Raccontami che cosa farai nei dettagli.
Ok. Allora, gli filo una mano sotto il vestito mentre la tipa sul palco schiatta litigi.
Non è il momento di scherzare. E poi scusa, se sai come finisce la guerra, perché non ci capisci niente?
Perché?
Fai il film fra una cosa.
Veramente. Guarda che io non ho bisogno del manuale di istruzioni per scoparmi la tipa.
Beh,
Ok?
forse non con le tue amiche, ma con una memoria sarebbe come.
Allora, avanti, visto che sei così esperta, fammi vedere come si fa, eh?
Non abbiamo tempo da perdere, soltami la prima.
Appunto. Vuoi sapere cosa farò quando sarà il momento giusto?
Ammesso che tu riesca a individuare il momento giusto, e ne dubito. Sentiamo tu.
Non mi sottovalutare, Lucia. Guarda che io so riconoscere una donna parlatura per non mostrarsi fragile, come una che piace spesso, ma che si farebbe ammazzare per dire peggio in pubblico. Una che si veste come un sergente, ma è fatta scrivata. Perché sei così bella. Una che si deve sempre l'orecchio destro tutte le volte di difficoltà. E poi un altro.
Antonio Smetti.
Allora?
Cosa?
Sono o non sono irresistibile?
Hai finito?
Okay. So here we see, of course, the emphasis on both the performative nature of masculinity and stardom. Antonio steps easily in and out of the role of perfect man, showing it to be a performance, and slightly parodying Scamacho's own star image at the same time. The reference to Beckham is also interesting with the nail varnish. The film is trying to plug into a then not quite contemporary vogue for the metrosexual, with the painting of Antonio's nails and the emphasis on fashion. We see a couple of montages of him trying on suits and complaining, always preferring his anorak and scarf. Of course, metrosexuality itself is deeply implicated in commodification, but it can also highlight alternative masculine narratives, at least for those privileged enough to afford it, as Peterson and Anderson say. Edward's idea of the metrosexual as homosocial figure, centred on men looking at other men, competing with other men, is here disavowed. As Lucia says, girls like men who paint their nails. Ultimately, of course, Lucia loves Antonio just the way he is, to paraphrase Bridget Jones, as he returns to his scarf and anorak for their final reunion scene. So towards the start of the film, the struggling actor Antonio is called to an audition for an advertising job by Lucia. He prides himself on being a serious actor who rejects commercials until he finds out how much it will pay. In the commercial audition, he is ridiculed for his out-of-placeness, as he's the only male model who has turned up. And it turns out the job is a pretext for Lucia to hire him for this personal project of seducing Maria. Significantly, Lucia is shown as being attracted to him by a Scamacho headshot, with a close-up of those famous eyes, rather than his body, which, as we can see, is not conventionally totally buff. The film's coda, though, reprises this scene very interestingly. Lucia presumably saves her job by actually casting Antonio in the advert for a cellulite cream, despite the earlier ridicule of him at the audition. The scene runs alongside the final titles after the romantic climax of the film, which has involved the two characters racing to the airport to get together. So I just want to show this bit and then I'll conclude by sort of analysing that a little bit. Okay, so this is the ending of the film.
Ho imparato da te. Ho imparato che nella vita non importa dove arrivi, ma la strada che percorri. Ho imparato che la parte migliore che puoi recitare è quella di te stesso.
Agisce in profondità, nei tessuti interstiziali, drenando i liquidi, riducendo il ristagno della circolazione e sgonfiando le cellule adipose che provocano la pelle a buccia arancia. I risultati già dopo 15 giorni di applicazione. Il Giro Coscia ti ringrazierà.
La mia, c'è lui dietro.
Okay, so here, of course, Antonio is objectified through the intradiegetic female gaze as he's parading his grooming techniques. And earlier in the film we saw him reluctantly attempting to work out because it goes against his seriousness as an actor. Here we see the visibility of the male body, which is partly drawn from gay culture. So Susan Bordeaux's work on Calvin Klein and the mainstreaming of a gay aesthetic. In the Italian context, Alvario has pointed to the Dolce & Gabbana ads of 2006, featuring the Milan football team as a key moment in this kind of mainstreaming of a certain type of gay aesthetic. The clip, of course, raises questions around feminization. Actually, in the Spanish film, from which this is adapted, the character at the end of the film is advertising sanitary towel. Both of these products, of course, associated with a certain kind of object femininity. So what does this mean, to conclude? Okay, who's looking? Steve Neill has, of course, written of the necessary disavowal of the erotic gaze on the male body. This ties in with Kenneth McKinnon's work on the secrecy often surrounding the gaze at the male. As McKinnon notes, the male star who presents his body as an object of the cinematic gaze seems to forfeit his reputation for an unassailable masculinity. Here, though, there is disavowal through humour. This is clearly a comic scene. This also means that the scene can be dismissed or seen as having no consequences, also because it's a coda tacked on to the end of the film, which not everyone might stay for. The Scamarcio here is, of course, slightly debased by association with his female genre, the rom-com, and with a female product. But who is this display for? For the presumptively female spectator of the rom-com, whereas the male spectator. Though we can't see, actually, there was a male intradiegetic spectator working on who nods approvingly rather than with desire at Scamarcio's non-cellulite body. Kenneth McKinnon notes how the outing of the male object affects assumptions and convictions about the gendered identities of viewing subjects and viewing and viewed objects. So we can see how a scene like this places all of those relationships into doubt. So one of the reasons this scene is unusual is that mainstream Italian cinema, I think, does not tolerate a high degree of male eroticization, despite the fact that many of its stars display their body outside the films. So for example, you see the Max calendars or whatever done by Luca Argentero in his early days, or by Raoul Bova. But diegetically, this kind of bodily display is rarely seen in Italian cinema and is traditionally a bit of a problem. So as I've said, ideas of feminization are linked to consumption, to consumerism, and also to the gendering of consumer culture. The resistance to the reshaping of the male body is likewise embedded in these discourses. And there's also an assumption, I think, that male beauty is assumed to be trivial and lightweight and to trivialize the actor himself. So, to conclude, to connect all this back to the cultural context, the discussion around Berlusconi's feminization, as I noted, exonerates hegemonic heterosexual masculinity. It's hard to avoid the reading by cultural commentators that Berlusconi would have behaved differently, better, and he behaved less like a woman. Reed distracted himself less with bodily vanity and surgery and placed less emphasis on self-care. Italian critics here appear to be misreading Judith Butler even when they cite her. There is no real gender identity beneath these performances. Let me say that. The sudden a posteriori emphasis on the aspects of Berlusconi's persona, now that he's no longer there, seems to reveal, I think, an anxiety, a deeper anxiety about feminization linked to consumer culture and the feminization of the political sphere in Italy and how those two ideas interrelate. Italian men, as elsewhere in Western culture, are encouraged to engage in regimes of self-care. However, we see the perceived danger of this when taken to the ultimate conclusion. So, the feminization of films, stars, genre, and culture are interlinked, and I think elsewhere have led to this emphasis on a kind of retrosexuality, a return to the 70s in a different key. L'Uomo Perfetto, I would say, is a film that flirts with all of these ideas only to ultimately reject them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for keeping to time so perfectly. So we'll move on to our next speaker, and hopefully you can save any questions that you might have for Catherine for the 10 minutes at the end. For our next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Bombaslara-Brady, who's currently studying in the Gender, Media and Culture MSc programme at the London School of Economics. She's most interested both as an activist and an academic in issues of race, gender, national identity, immigration and social justice movements. The title of Jessica's paper today is Framing Race and Masculinities, African Migrant Protests and Political Responses in Italy.